This beggar girl reveals a secret involving a nurse, but minutes later, something shocking happens. Comment and give my story a rating from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important, and become a member of my channel for access to exclusive videos. The silence of the funeral home chapel was shattered by a sharp scream that echoed off the dark marble walls. The 4-year-old beggar girl burst through the main entrance, her bare feet leaving muddy footprints on the polished floor, pointing a trembling finger at the on-duty nurse standing near the casket. "She did it! She killed Grandpa!" the child shouted in a hoarse voice, breaking the respectful mourning that hung over the mourners gathered at the wake of the patriarch of one of the most respected families in the big city. Everyone present turned in shock. The girl looked barely 2 years old due to her extreme frailty, with torn and dirty clothes that looked like they had been scavenged from dumpsters, matted hair, and eyes too big for her thin face. She contrasted sharply with the luxurious setting of the funeral home, where expensive flowers adorned every corner and people dressed in elegant attire paid their last respects. The 30-year-old widowed millionaire, a strikingly handsome man with the look of a matinee idol and an imposing presence, immediately rose from the front row pew. His tailored black suit accentuated his athletic build, and his green eyes showed a mixture of irritation and embarrassment at the unexpected interruption. "Security, get this child out of here immediately," he ordered in a firm voice, gesturing toward the funeral home employees. "This is no place for tasteless pranks." But something in the girl's desperate gaze made him hesitate. There was a disturbing intensity in those dark eyes, a seriousness that didn't match her apparent age. She kept pointing at the nurse, trembling not only from cold, but from a deep emotion he couldn't identify. The nurse, a middle-aged woman with a perpetually serene face and an impeccably white uniform, paled visibly at the accusation. Her hands, which held a clipboard with medical documents, began to tremble slightly. When she opened her mouth to defend herself, her words shocked everyone present. "He spent the last 3 days asking for ice water, but he could only take small sips," she said, addressing the millionaire directly. "He mentioned several times that he felt chest pains during the early hours, especially between 2 and 3 a.m. On Thursday, he asked me if I had children and said he was sorry for not being a better father." The silence that followed was deafening. Those intimate details about the patriarch's last days were information that only someone very close to the family could know. The millionaire felt the blood run cold in his veins. None of these details had been shared publicly, and even among family members, only he and his stepmother knew about the intimate conversations of the final moments. "How do you know that?" he questioned, approaching the nurse with firm steps. "Those conversations happened when I was alone with my father. No one else was present." The nurse lowered her eyes, her hands trembling even more visibly. The girl remained in the same spot, now hugging her own thin arms, watching the adult's reaction with a disturbing attentiveness for someone so young. I was on duty during all those nights," the nurse murmured, avoiding eye contact. "Sometimes I overheard when I passed by in the hallway to check on other patients." But the millionaire knew the layout of the private hospital where his father had been admitted well. The room was isolated, with thick walls and a door that was always closed. It was impossible to hear conversations from the hallway, especially those whispered in low tones during moments of vulnerability. The stepmother, an elegant woman in her 50s who always maintained an impeccable posture, approached her stepson. Her expression showed concern, but there was something calculated in her movements, as if each gesture was carefully planned. "Darling, this whole situation is very stressful for all of us," she said, placing her hand protectively on his arm. "Perhaps we should continue the ceremony and deal with this later, at a more appropriate time." But the millionaire couldn't take his eyes off the girl. There was something familiar in those features, a persistent feeling that he had seen her before, even if he couldn't remember where. The child continued to watch every movement, every facial expression, as if she were cataloguing important information. The guests began to whisper among themselves, creating a low murmur that increased the tension in the room. Some people took out their cell phones, clearly considering documenting the unusual event. The family's reputation, built over decades, was being tested before the eyes of the entire local society. The nurse took a step back, clearly uncomfortable with the growing attention. Her face, normally serene and professional, now showed obvious signs of nervousness. She held the clipboard against her chest as if it were a protective shield. "Perhaps I should excuse myself," she murmured. "I don't want to cause any more embarrassment for the family at such a difficult time." But the girl, who had remained silent since her initial accusation, spoke again with surprising clarity for her apparent age. "She put different medicine in the IV. I saw it from the window. Grandpa got very weak after that." All heads turned to the child. The specificity of her statement was disturbing, especially considering that she clearly lived on the streets and shouldn't have access to detailed medical information. The millionaire felt a wave of nausea. His father had indeed become significantly weaker in recent days, a deterioration that doctors had attributed to the natural progression of his heart condition. But what if there was something more? The atmosphere in the chapel became almost suffocating. The air conditioning seemed inadequate for the growing number of people present, and the heavy perfume of the funeral flowers mingled with the scent of anxiety and fear that emanated from those present. No one knew how to proceed. The wake of a respected man had turned into something none of those present could have imagined, and the implications of the girl's words were only beginning to be understood. 3 weeks after the wake, the millionaire couldn't get the image of the girl out of his mind. He had hired a private investigator to locate the child, but she had simply disappeared from the streets as if she had never existed. The area's hospitals had no records of a patient with her characteristics, and local shelters denied any knowledge of her. During these days, he had obsessively revisited the last moments with his father. Each conversation, each facial expression, each change in the patriarch's behavior was analyzed for clues that could confirm or refute the girl's words. His considerable fortune, accumulated through strategic investments in stocks and diversified applications, seemed insignificant in the face of the possibility that his father had suffered at the hands of someone they trusted. The nurse had resigned from the hospital the day after the wake, citing personal reasons. When he tried to contact her, he discovered that she had moved out of town without leaving a forwarding address. This sudden escape only fueled his growing suspicions that something terrible had actually happened. On a rainy afternoon, while reviewing financial documents in his luxurious office, the millionaire received an unexpected call. On the other end of the line, a nervous female voice identified herself as a social worker from a temporary shelter on the outskirts of the city. "Sir, we have a child here who mentions your name constantly," the woman said. "She appeared at our door 2 days ago, malnourished and in a state of shock. When we asked where she saw you, she just repeats that it was in a big house with many flowers." The millionaire's heart leaped. He cancelled all of the day's meetings and immediately drove to the address provided. The shelter was a modest but clean building located in a working-class neighborhood far from his world of wealth and stratospheric net worth. When he arrived, he found the girl sitting in a corner of the recreation room, drawing with crayons on a piece of paper. She was visibly cleaner, wearing donated clothes that, although simple, were appropriate for her actual size. Upon seeing him, her eyes lit up with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Did you believe me?" was the first thing she said, standing up slowly and keeping a safe distance. "I'm trying to understand what really happened," he replied, crouching down to her level. "Can you tell me where you saw my father? How did you know those details about him?" The girl looked around, checking if they were alone, before whispering, "I lived under the fire escape of the hospital. There's a broken window on the 3rd floor that no one fixes. I could see and hear everything that happened in Grandpa's room. The revelation hit him like a punch. The fire escape of the private hospital was rarely used, located at the rear of the building, away from the eyes of security. A small child could easily go unnoticed in that location, especially if she knew how to hide properly. "How long have you been there?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Many days. Since it started getting cold," she replied, showing him the drawing she was making. It was a rudimentary but surprisingly detailed representation of a woman in a white uniform changing something in a small vial. "She did it when you left to get something to eat." The millionaire examined the drawing more closely. Despite the childlike technique, there were specific details that disturbed him. The shape of the vial, the position of the bed, even the location of the window was correct. A child couldn't invent these specifics without having actually witnessed the scene. "Can you draw other things you saw?" he asked, sitting on the floor next to her. Over the next hour, the girl produced a series of drawings that chronologically reconstructed the events of her father's last days. Each image told a part of the story. The nurse always arriving at the same times, secret conversations in the hallway with an elegant woman he recognized as his stepmother, and especially the moment when she changed the contents of the medication vials. "The elegant lady always brought an envelope to the nurse," the girl said, carefully coloring the dress of the female figure in one of her drawings. "They talked quietly, but I learned to read lips when I lived on the streets. It's important to know when adults are lying." Her ability to read lips explained how she had captured details of intimate conversations. Children living on the streets develop extraordinary survival skills, including the ability to observe and interpret adult behavior to avoid danger. "What did they say?" he asked, feeling a mixture of fascination and horror at the child's precocious intelligence. "The elegant lady talked about important papers and about you being very sad." The nurse looked scared, always shook her head and looked at the envelope. "I saw money inside once." The millionaire felt the blood run cold. His stepmother had inherited a significant portion of the family fortune, but had always shown an interest in expanding her share of the business. He had attributed this to natural ambition, never imagining that there might be something more sinister behind her intentions. "Did you tell anyone at the shelter about this?" he asked, already dreading the answer. The girl shook her head negatively. "Adults never believe kids like me. They think we make up stories to get food or attention." At that moment, the social worker approached, informing him that visiting hours were coming to an end. But before leaving, the girl grabbed his hand with a surprising strength for someone so frail. "She's still around," she whispered urgently. "The nurse. I saw her yesterday near the church, talking to the same elegant lady. They're planning something new." The millionaire drove home with his mind in turmoil. The girl's revelations confirmed his worst suspicions, but also raised even more disturbing questions. If his stepmother was really involved in manipulating his father's medications, what were her true motivations? And why was the nurse still in town if she had supposedly fled? Upon arriving at his mansion, he found his stepmother in the living room, leafing through documents he recognized as being related to family investments in high-yield funds and applications. She looked up with a smile that now seemed forced. "How was your day, darling?" she asked in her usual sweet voice. "You seem worried about something." He decided to test his suspicions. "I found the girl from the wake today. She was at a shelter and told me some interesting things about my father's last days." The stepmother's expression changed subtly. For a split second, a shadow of something that could have been fear or anger passed through her eyes before returning to the mask of maternal concern. "Darling, you can't take the fantasies of a traumatized child seriously," she said, closing the documents and approaching him. "These street children make up elaborate stories to get attention." It's a well-known defense mechanism. But her response only confirmed his growing suspicions. How did she know the girl lived on the streets? He hadn't mentioned that detail, and at the wake, Nothing necessarily indicated that the child was homeless beyond her appearance. Night fell on the mansion with an oppressive weight. The millionaire ate dinner in silence, watching his stepmother's every move, every carefully chosen word. The woman he had considered a second mother for years now seemed like a dangerous stranger sitting at his table. 2 months after discovering the girl's location, the millionaire had established a routine of visits to the shelter. Each encounter revealed new, disturbing details about his father's last days. The child possessed an extraordinary ability to recall minutiae that an adult would never notice, from the exact time the nurse arrived to the specific way his stepmother held the envelope during the secret exchanges. During one of these visits, the girl showed him a drawing that left him deeply uneasy. It depicted his father in a hospital bed, but there was something different about his expression, a mixture of confusion and fear that he had never personally noticed. In the drawing, a female figure in a white uniform held 2 different vials, while an elegant shadow watched from the door. "Grandpa tried to talk to me once," the girl revealed, carefully coloring the details of the scene. "He waved from the window when he saw I was watching. He looked very sad and pointed to the IV as if he wanted to show me something important." The revelation that his father had perceived the child's presence and tried to communicate with her added a new dimension of pain to the situation. The patriarch, in his final moments, had tried to seek help from the only available witness, a 4-year-old girl living on the streets. Determined to find concrete evidence, the millionaire hired a private investigator specializing in medical negligence cases. The man, a former detective with extensive experience in corporate crime, began to meticulously examine the hospital's medical records and the nurse's professional background. 3 weeks later, the investigator brought information that confirmed his worst fears. The nurse had been fired from 2 previous hospitals for unspecified irregularities in her professional conduct. More alarming still, she had been hired at the hospital where his father was admitted just 1 month before his admission, personally recommended by someone the investigator had not yet been able to identify. "There's something else," the investigator said, showing him financial documents. "The nurse's bank account received 3 substantial deposits in the last weeks of your father's life. The amounts coincide exactly with the dates your stepmother made significant withdrawals from her personal account." The millionaire examined the statements with growing horror. The transferred amounts represented tens of thousands of dollars, sums that a regular nurse could never justify as legitimate income. His stepmother, who had always claimed concern about the family's excessive spending, had been moving large sums without any plausible explanation. That night, he decided to confront his stepmother directly. He waited until she was alone in the mansion's library, reviewing the family business's accounting books. The room, with its mahogany bookshelves and soft lighting, had been the scene of many important conversations over the years, but never one as crucial as the one that was about to happen. "We need to talk about the last weeks of my father's life," he said, entering the library and closing the door behind him. "And about your contacts with the nurse who cared for him?" The stepmother looked up from the documents, her expression remaining carefully neutral. "I don't understand what you're referring to, darling. I barely knew the nurse, other than polite greetings during visits." "I have evidence of bank transfers," he continued, approaching the table where she was sitting. "Considerable amounts leaving your account and arriving directly into hers. How do you explain that?" For a moment, the stepmother's mask of tranquility faltered. Her fingers tightened slightly around the pen she was holding, and a muscle in her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. But she quickly regained her composure. "You're being manipulated by a traumatized child," she said, getting up and walking to the window. "That girl clearly has serious psychological problems. Abandoned children often develop elaborate fantasies as a survival mechanism. Then, how do you explain that she knew intimate details about his last conversations with me? Information that only you and I knew," he pressed, observing every micro-expression on her face. The stepmother sighed deeply, as if making a difficult decision. When she turned to face him, there were genuine tears in her eyes, a display of emotion he had rarely witnessed. "All right, there's something I've never told you," she said, returning to her seat and gesturing for him to do the same. "Your father was losing his judgment in recent months. He'd made some very bad financial decisions, lost a lot of money in speculative investments. He was desperate to recover the family fortune." The revelation hit him like an electric shock. His father had always been extremely conservative with money, preferring safe investments in stable funds and established stocks. The idea that he had engaged in risky financial speculation contradicted everything he knew about the patriarch's character. "What kind of bad decisions?" he asked, trying to process the information. He had invested a substantial amount in volatile cryptocurrencies, believing he could quickly recover previous losses. The stepmother continued, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. "When the market crashed, he lost almost half of the company's available capital. He was considering desperate measures to hide the loss." "What kind of measures?" he insisted, feeling a growing weight in his stomach. The stepmother hesitated, as if struggling with herself about how much to reveal. He had mentioned the possibility of simulating more serious health problems to accelerate certain transfers of assets. He wanted to ensure that you received the inheritance before creditors discovered the extent of the losses. The explanation was plausible, but something didn't quite fit. The millionaire knew the family finances well, having worked side by side with his father in managing the investments. He had never noticed suspicious movements or significant losses that justified such desperation. "If that's true, why didn't you tell me before? Why hide this information during the funeral and afterward?" he questioned, watching her reactions closely. "Because I wanted to protect his memory," she replied, her voice choked. "Your father was a proud man. He made me promise that I would never reveal the financial mistakes he made in recent months. He didn't want you to remember him as someone who put the family at risk." The explanation had an emotional logic that he couldn't deny. He knew his father's pride well and his obsession with maintaining the family's impeccable reputation. But there were still gaps in the story that deeply bothered him. "And the nurse? How does she fit into all of this?" he asked, determined to get complete answers. The stepmother took a deep breath before responding. "Your father had asked her to help him appear sicker than he really was. Nothing that would cause real harm, just minor alterations in medication that would make him seem more frail in medical evaluations. He believed this would accelerate certain legal processes related to the transfer of assets." The version presented by the stepmother was sophisticated and emotionally convincing. She had built a narrative that explained all the strange elements of the situation: the bank transfers, the nurse's behavior, even the detailed knowledge about the intimate conversations. But there was something in the way she presented the facts that still disturbed him. "I need time to process all of this," he said finally, getting up from the armchair. "This is too much information to absorb all at once." "Of course, darling," the stepmother replied, also getting up and approaching him. "I know it's hard to discover that your father wasn't perfect, but he did everything out of love for the family, even if he got lost in the process." When he left the library, the millionaire felt even more confused than before. The stepmother's explanation answered many questions, but raised others that were equally disturbing. If his father had really been involved in desperate schemes to protect the family fortune, it completely changed his perception of the events of recent months. But one doubt persisted. If it was all just a misguided attempt to protect the family, why had the girl seemed so genuinely terrified when accusing the nurse? And why had her descriptions of the events been so accurate and disturbing? 6 months had passed since the wake, and the millionaire still couldn't find peace. The stepmother's explanation seemed plausible on the surface, but small details continued to bother him. During his regular visits to the shelter, he had developed a genuine bond with the girl, impressed by her precocious intelligence and extraordinary observational skills. On a particularly hot afternoon, the child showed him a new drawing that would change everything. Unlike the previous ones, this depicted a scene she had witnessed weeks after his father's death, his stepmother and the nurse talking at a coffee shop downtown. "They still meet," the girl said, pointing to the figures on the paper. "I saw them yesterday when the shelter lady took me to the doctor." The elegant lady looked very angry, and the nurse was crying. The millionaire's heart raced. If the stepmother had told the truth about the nurse having left town, why were they still in contact? And more importantly, what could they be discussing months after the events that had supposedly ended their collaboration? Determined to find out the truth, he hired an investigator to discreetly follow his stepmother for a few days. What he discovered left him in shock. She was holding regular meetings with the nurse in different locations around the city, always at discreet times and places where they were rarely observed by acquaintances. During one of these meetings, the investigator managed to capture photos and partial audio of the conversation. The recordings revealed disturbing fragments, discussions about keeping the story straight, concerns about the child remembering too much, and references to documents that needed to be destroyed. Armed with this evidence, the millionaire decided to make one last visit to the girl before taking decisive action. He found her in the shelter's garden, drawing birds flying freely, a recurring theme in her works that he had begun to interpret as her desire to escape the traumatic memories. "I need you to tell me everything you remember about my father's last days," he said, sitting next to her on the grass. "Every detail, even if it seems small or unimportant." The girl watched him with her big, serious eyes, as if she could perceive the gravity of the moment. Then, with a precision that took his breath away, she reconstructed a detailed chronology of the events she had witnessed. "The first day I saw Grandpa, he seemed fine. He talked a lot, and even laughed when you told a funny story," she began. "But after the nurse started changing the medicines, he became different, more confused, weaker." "When exactly did she start changing the medications?" he asked, feeling a chill down his spine. "It was after the elegant lady came for the first time. They talked in the hallway for a long time. The nurse shook her head, saying, 'No,' but the lady showed papers and money. After that, everything changed." The girl continued her narrative, describing how she had watched her father's gradual deterioration over the days. But the most shocking detail came when she mentioned something she had witnessed on the last night. Grandpa woke up in the middle of the night and called the nurse. He was very scared and said he had discovered something terrible about the papers he had signed. He said someone had changed the words after he signed. The millionaire felt as if the world had stopped. What kind of papers? He was talking about an inheritance, about leaving money for children like me. But he said someone had changed everything, that the money was going to the wrong person. The girl continued, her eyes filling with tears as she recalled. "The nurse got very nervous and left to make a call. Then she came back with the elegant lady, even though it was very late." The final revelation hit the millionaire like lightning. His stepmother had discovered about the change in the will and had orchestrated a plan to prevent the changes from becoming valid. The nurse had been coerced into administering excessive sedatives that would prevent his father from communicating his true final intentions. But there was still one crucial question. Where were the original documents that his father had hidden? "Do you remember seeing where they put the papers they took from the drawer?" he asked urgently. The girl thought for a moment before answering. "The elegant lady put everything in a big bag. But before they left, Grandpa gestured to me at the window. He pointed to the ceiling and then did this." She demonstrated the motion of writing. "I think he wanted to tell me that he had hidden something up there." That night, the millionaire returned to the hospital room where his father had spent his last days. Using his connections to gain access after hours, he meticulously examined the room. Finally, he found what he was looking for, a small opening in the ceiling panel where he discovered a sealed envelope containing the original will and a handwritten letter in his father's own hand. The letter revealed everything. His father had discovered that his stepmother had been embezzling funds from the family business for years, using secret bank accounts to hide millions in personal investments. He had changed the will not only to benefit charities, but also to ensure that she did not have full access to the assets he had helped build with stolen money. More importantly, the letter specifically mentioned the brave girl who watches from the window and asked that she be cared for and protected, as she had been the only witness to his final fight for the truth. With all the evidence in hand, the millionaire confronted his stepmother in a final meeting. Faced with the original documents, the investigators' recordings, and the girl's detailed testimony, she finally confessed. She had discovered the diversions years ago and panicked when she realized her stepson might also find out. The plan had been simple: ensure that the patriarch died before he could reveal her discoveries or permanently alter the will. The nurse, initially reluctant, had been coerced through blackmail involving minor irregularities in her previous career. The outcome was swift but just. The stepmother was forced to return all illegally acquired assets, losing her position in the family and in the company. The nurse, in exchange for her full cooperation, received immunity and the opportunity to restart her career in another city, far from the traumatic memories. But the biggest transformation happened in the girl's life. Inspired by his father's last wish, the millionaire initiated the adoption process, determined to offer her the security and love that had been denied in her early years. The child, who had lived on the streets observing the world through broken windows, now had a real home. Her extraordinary ability to observe and remember, developed as a survival mechanism, became a gift that saved not only her own life, but also exposed the truth that might have remained buried forever. 6 months later, while watching the girl playing in the garden of his estate, the millionaire understood that sometimes the truest families are those we choose through love and responsibility, not just those we are born into. The child who had burst into his wake as a disruptive force had become the light that illuminated his life, proving that even in the darkest situations, truth and justice always find a way to prevail. The wealth he had inherited, his stocks, investments, and assets, now had a greater purpose, ensuring that no child would go through what his adopted daughter had faced, and that his father's memory would be honored through acts of compassion and protection for the most vulnerable. If you enjoyed this wonderful story, please comment. Your opinion is very important. And if you love beautiful stories, subscribe to my channel. I promise to make your day better with my videos.